All right, it is just a bit past 4:15, and we'll get the HR committee rolling for January 2018. So first up on our agenda is the HR report on action items. Everybody have a chance to review that? Have questions? And I know we're logging into our Chromebooks, so give it a few moments.
Anyone need support?
That's a loaded question.
So we're looking at the HR report, action items for 123. Yeah, Member Oswald, sorry.
Thank you, Chair Gorham. Welcome. Thanks for doing this. It's a tough thing, tough gig to get us going. I noticed that that the staffing report isn't actually an item, but I had a question on the staffing report. Under the non-certified resignations, there is a custodian that resigned, and then there's a rescind resignation later. Could you just explain? I noticed that it happened there, and it was in another spot also.
2 spots.
Sure. And so, why is if they're rescinding their resignation, is that in a different category, or why is it placed in resignation? And are they currently employed?
So for each board type item, we put a board type item in the report. And when somebody resigns, we put it there. And when there's a change to anything in a report, it goes back into the same category. So the individual resigned, then rescinded per their contract. So it goes back there. And yes, the person is employed as of 1/8 of 18. Mm-hmm.
Any further questions? All right, moving on then, we have a placeholder for the pay equity report. Mr. Swirsky, anything to comment on that?
Ironically, the month that we're switching over, we all have paper to hand out.
Thank you.
Member Loeffler-Kemp had asked at a previous meeting that I would hand out the previous pay equity report that we did in 2015. This is a report required by the state that's done every 3 years. So we're in the process of working on the one right now for this year. That will be good for the next 3 years. But this is a copy of our compliance report from 2015. And I just wanted to point out a few things, and these are the things that we look for when we do this compliance report. You notice when we talk about all the male classes, this is in that general job class information. There's male job classes and female job classes, and the number of employees. There's a much higher number of female employees in the district, and I think this is one of the reasons why we do very well on this report. So then we get down to the first test, the statistical analysis test. And here they talk about an underpayment ratio, and this would be as if you're underpayment for one group or the other. And the statistic is geared towards the underpayment of female employees, but the minimum qualification is that the female employees make 80% of the male employees. But as you can see, last time we did this, the underpayment ratio was a plus 111% of the male employees. So there's statistical measures on all of them. So for that one, the minimum is 80%, and we came in at 111. There's a t-test value. They do a predicted pay range, And for that, you have to be less than 1.645. I can't tell you what the significance of that 1.645 is, but it's something in their formula. And we came in at a minus 15.231. And again, I think it's because of that balance of male to female employees. The next test range, again, the years to maximum salary for male jobs and the female jobs, it looks at the actual number of males in certain categories, but we have male, females both in almost all of our job classifications. So again, that salary range, you're looking at 80% or more, and we came in at 86.34. And on the exceptional service pay test, again, I should have brought the other one. Exceptional service pay, I think that is additional, like longevity and some of the other things that would be tied on there. And again, the minimum was 80%, and we came in at 89.44. So those are the tests that they're looking for in order to pass. They end up putting all of the classifications on a chart. That's that last page. And they draw a line, and you can kind of see where you are with some of these positions. Jobs that only have a male in it. So it could be open to male and female, and most likely is, but there may only be males in it, are indicated with that diamond shape. Female jobs, that again, all the jobs are open to male and female. But if there's only a female in it for whatever that position is, it's indicated by that square. And then the balanced jobs are the ones that we currently have both male and female in those positions. So.
Thank you. Sally?
Yeah,
Board Member Trinka,
who
sorry.
sets, that's, you call me whatever you want. Who sets that 80% underpayment ratio?
It's done by the state.
Okay, so
Yeah,
we can't change it to 100% to be the
Right.
progressive community we are. Okay, thank you.
We can make that our goal, I suppose, but it's, yeah, for this purpose.
Any further questions?
Yep. Hi.
Member Loeffler again?
Yep. I just want to follow up. Is there a time frame when this has to be reported every year? Is it the same time every year?
Correct. Yeah, it's every 3 years, and it is due before the end of the month.
Thank you.
The end of this month?
End of this month.
Okay.
Yep.
Right. All right, seeing no further questions, we'll move on to the approval of hourly wage rates for hourly employees.
You want to take this?
So we met with Alana, Tim and I did, to discuss the hourly wage rates for the hourly employees. And we're working on some items for Alana, and we determined that our next steps would be to get back with her at a time that's convenient with her. And Alana can certainly respond to that. I believe that there was, as I recall, a motion to table until we had further discussions and came up with. Some of the items that we discussed was looking at a way to have some type of a step and to look at ways in which we would be able to make this work for the hourly employees, and taking into consideration some of the things that kind of cause a little bit of challenge for us, such as things like anniversary date and what date would it be effective for, which employee group, which of the hourly employees would be eligible, is it in hours, they have to work a number of hours, and et cetera. So we had some nice conversations around that, and I think that's our update.
Thank you. Member Oswald?
I do appreciate the conversation we had, and I look forward to working with you more. The biggest barrier I took from our conversation was the handwritten timesheets for hourly employees. That presents significant challenge and unique challenges to that archaic method of doing things. And so I'm hoping that as a result of how we're proceeding, that we can be able to consider updating that system to make it work better and streamline services, consolidate, just make it easier. And I hope we can make that investment because that would really remove a lot of challenges that we're working with. But we'll overcome them even if we can't. So,
Member Lofall?
Do we have a copy of this resolution? I remember hearing it or seeing something at a meeting when I was not a sitting board member, but is it in our packet? Do we have one? We don't have one.
Could I answer?
Superintendent Graseth?
There isn't a current resolution. There was a resolution proposed that didn't pass, but it was with the understanding that we would be coming back with another proposal. And so as we work through that, we'll get there. My other question was, with the ASIP software, does that go electronic from paper?
It has a capability of doing some of that, as well as, I believe, even the system we have now. It might fall outside the realm of our system capabilities and the other things we would need in order to implement that.
Any further questions on this topic? All right, then we'll move into number 2, informational items and superintendent review.
I didn't make copies for everybody because I think a number of you have just been to some MASBA training on the superintendent evaluation forms, but essentially we have one that we've developed for the superintendent here, and it is a number of pages, and I think there's probably about more than 50 questions on there. But that we do under main category areas such as curriculum and instruction leadership, leadership and communication qualities, community and public relations, business and financial management, employee relations, board superintendent relationship. I think there's student relationships on here, student relations, intergovernmental relations, and planning and goals. So it's all those categories. It's been a pretty long, involved one. Everybody would fill out this sheet, give a rating number. We'd do an average of the rating number and then come up with an average within each of those groups and then an overall. I believe the training that has been out there, you're working off a packet that's something like this. And this is much more, it's goal-oriented. It looks like there's a maximum of maybe 5 goals that you give to focus on, and some are strict district goals with a couple of other goals that are in another category. I think the question is there's been conversation about maybe moving to a more goal-oriented. In the agenda setting, we had a conversation with David, and I know you were going to check with MASBA in terms of, was it an individual we were looking at as far as working with the district on goals?
Excuse me. I had talked with the School Board Association about having a retreat, so to speak, and that could be one of the topics that we could discuss at that time.
Yeah. Go ahead. Member Tricka?
Yeah, I think Alana and David and I were able to. Go ahead, Rosie. Oh, okay. Went to that session at the training last week, and they gave us a lot of really good tools that I think would be helpful. The piece that I go back to is I think that that some of the goals need to be tied to the strategic plan, and so I think that we need to talk about, I don't know where the appropriate setting is. Sorry, first meeting. But getting that on the calendar, because I would hate for your review to not happen until November, for example. And so, but making sure that those goals are tied to what it is that we identify as strategic objectives for the district, I think would be important.
Member Lafleur-Kemp.
And my comment falls kind of on the same thing about both wanting the review to happen in a timely way for the superintendent, but also recognizing we have 3 new board members who haven't been through this process yet, and maybe recommending we go with the process we've used this year, so that would help you kind of compare another process. And can you maybe kind of talk a little bit about the timeline? That might be helpful as well, that we've used in the past anyways.
Yes, the piece I would add to that, if the interest is to moving to more goal-oriented type review, the important factors of that would be developing the goals and giving the superintendent time to work towards those goals. But we could certainly use the previous review for this cycle here, and then maybe at the time that there's feedback on that review, there's goals developed. Would be talking within a month or two, or I don't know if there's a retreat scheduled.
It's not planned, although Member Trink and Oswald and I had talked about forming a subcommittee, so to speak, to go over this. The State School Board Association also suggested a bi-yearly, every 6 months evaluation. And so we could maybe go with with what we've done in the past now to get things going, and in the meantime develop that goal-oriented thing that we could then use. That's a suggestion too.
So do we, okay, we go. Okay.
And all of this, in a sense, has to be done with the superintendent. He is part of the evaluation.
So some of my questions were answered in the fact that there's a timeline every 6 months. So when was our last superintendent evaluation?
It was a year ago.
Okay. And so my input would just be with my familiarity with valuations. We've all probably done them in our work environment. I really like the second model, even though we haven't used it, and it's goal-centered, and I know it looks like we might not have goals, but I'd like to push us a little bit towards that instead of going back to that old model, because as I listened to Tim list off those categories that we're evaluating a superintendent on, I think some of them are archaic. Some of them we don't, unless we, I mean, is the process that we seek those specific opportunities out to watch him interact with students, and how does that work? I just think some of those categories are not authentic. And so I'd rather go with goals. I think we can get that done and still have a timely evaluation. I like the second one.
Chair Kirby.
Thanks. There is no state statute that requires a superintendent evaluation. So this is in our policy. That's one thing. And secondly, with this goal-oriented procedure, they suggested no more than 2 goals. I mean, we're not looking at dozens. Maybe a couple personal, a couple of systemic goals, and that's it. So it's easy to say what they are. It's more difficult to come up with objective, measurable, usable items. And so that's what takes the time. So that's why I suggested the 3 of us who went to the session at least start, so we can present something to everybody else, and you have something to work from rather than starting out from scratch. That'd be my suggestion.
Superintendent Grotzeth.
I just thought I'd chime in because because it's all about me. I fully support moving towards a goal-based model. The model that we've used is based on the competencies that are covered in a superintendent's training. And so that's what the 50-some items are, is each of those sub-items in each of those categories. And I think you're right. It's difficult for you to see every single one of those scenarios and be able to rank it that way. As long as I have some time before being evaluated. You can't set goals and then be immediately measured on without some time to work on those. And as Chair Kirby indicated, I'd like to be a part of that process as well. And I think, any goals that were set should probably include some of the district level team and the and the strategic plan of the district.
Member Oswald?
And during that training, I just wanted to point out that nothing against Mr. Swirsky, you do a fine job, but they emphasized that all of the evaluations should go through the board chair, and the board chair compiles the summary and handles everything. It relieves you of the awkwardness of having to give an evaluation on your boss, which is not exactly okay. So I just wanted to make that comment and make that clear that that's what MSBA recommended, and I think is a very wise thing to do, and I hope that we can adhere to that model. I'm very optimistic that we can come up with two goals. You know, they emphasized one being systemic, one being professional development wise, and developing those with your input. And they emphasized on not being perfect, but just starting somewhere. You have to start somewhere, and you know it's a trial, and we got to tweak it as we go, and you know eventually increase maybe a couple more goals up to a maximum of 5, of course, and you know if we choose to need that many. But you know to start off, 2 is just great, and we just have to get something on paper to try to do, and you know gather feedback to make sure that it all works out.
Further questions or comments from the group here? All right. Mr. Swirsky?
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm clear. So we will not proceed with the previous review that we've had before, and we'll set time to set a couple goals, and that would put the review out probably about 6 months or so, or maybe longer. If we were going to do something sooner than that, we would have to use another tool, because he would not have had opportunities to work on the goals that were set.
Member Oswald?
I'm all for going the other evaluation. A year has gone by, and our board dynamic has changed greatly with the addition of 3 new members. The process and timeline of developing a new evaluation isn't necessarily just one meeting and done. They have a timeline of it in and of itself, so it may take a couple months. I'm okay with that, being that Superintendent Gronseth will know that we're still watching him, watching what he does and how he does it. You know, I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunity to give him feedback along the way before we come up with a formalized plan. They don't expect it to just be done in a week, so. I know that in the example they gave was starting in the summer and then implementing it the following spring. But I think we've been far enough along in the process between Chair Kirby and I that we can get Member Trinka up to date and up to speed with us to cut that time maybe in half.
Chair Kirby?
When was the last evaluation we did? I can't remember.
It was a year ago, I believe, December.
It was in December, okay.
And is that evaluation available currently, or would it be possible to see it?
There's an overall rating on that was out for, general public and that, and it basically has a rating within every one of those individual areas. So.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I'm not listening close enough. So, we thought we'd do this in the interim and then set the goal ones, or not do this at all? Okay.
It seems like consensus is that we move forward with the goal-oriented evaluation. Is that correct, Board? Anyone who disagree with that? Maybe a quick point of clarification I have for Chair Kirby is this subcommittee would be working as a smaller group of 3, but the entire board and the superintendent would be involved in the process of evaluation, correct?
My feeling would just be to bring something to the whole board to then. It's just easier for a small group. We've been through this to get it going, and then you can respond and change it and do whatever you want. But
that sounds like a guess to me. Thank you.
Yeah,
sounds good. Yep.
I would just add that packet that Mr. Swirsky was handed out at the conference, and I didn't go through the training this year, but I went through it last year, so I also have a copy of it. I think it's on the website of NSBA as well, so it's available. There's also some additional training by the School Board Association for any other board members who went to the other option that we had last week and still would like to go through the superintendent workshop. And I think it's coming up within the next 6 weeks. So I'd encourage that because we all hear things differently when we're in workshops and learn things as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I was also able to attend one of those, I guess, mini sessions, and I just think it is a really good practice for districts to do, and I'm excited that we're moving forward with it. So, any further comments on this topic?
I've got one other thing.
Yeah.
It's more along the informational items, and I didn't know where they were going to be prior to this meeting, but we have reached a tentative agreement with our paraprofessional group as well as our maintenance and operations group. So they have red line copies that are out for them to ratify, and I would expect to be bringing those contracts to the board in February.
Excellent, thank you. And I see no future items. I'm sorry, my Chromebook here went dead, but I think that covers the agenda. Yeah, it went to sleep. It's all charged, but yeah. So that's a wrap on the HR committee. Meeting adjourned.
You push one of the buttons. Okay. And with that, we'll move into the business committee meeting. And I'm going to ask for a lot of patience and latitude today, both since we're dealing with Chromebooks for the first time and looking at 40 pages of financial reports on a Chromebook is not always easy. So if you're, to be respectful, if you're looking at a specific page, if you're referencing a page, if you could let us know which page you're looking at so that we can all be on the same page. I'm also going to ask that we move the conversation about compensatory education revenue update that starts on page 145 to the top of the agenda. I want to make sure we have all of our good brain power for this robust conversation. I've asked Superintendent Gronseth to kick us off with any support that he may want from Doug, so just so that we're all on the same page as we start, so we all have the same basic understanding of what it is that Member Sandstead requested of the administration, and that'll help kick off our report. So Superintendent Gronseth is going to do some illustrations for us.
Yeah, I can do some illustrations. You know, I do want to say that this has been a robust conversation, and that you know, we're glad to be able to figure out some possible reallocation worksheets. I also want to remind folks that in the committee of the whole tomorrow, we're going to be going over all of the revenue sources for the district and whether they're, you know, local, state, federal, how they're determined, so what is the measurement, how those funds can be used, and be talking about some projections for next year for each of those areas and where we'll be. So just keep in mind that this is a piece of a larger process that we're going through as well. So tonight we're going to be walking through some information, and you received it ahead of time, that looks at 80% allocation, 80% of the generated portion for each building in the allocation. And there's some other pieces, and I know that when I've been talking to a few of you, I've been kind of drawing some pictures, and Member Trinka suggested, well, maybe other people would benefit from these pictures that you're drawing, because I too am, you know, teacher in the classroom and have to draw most everything I do, right? So, what we've been doing in the past is we've been looking at the comp ed funding, as if you would see it as a pie, and we cut that whole pie in half, as statute says is allowable, and 50% would be used on a district-wide basis, and 50% or thereabouts would be to individual sites. The majority of this district-wide site was then reallocated to the sites on a student by student basis. So there's a good chunk of that also got allocated to the buildings. What we're talking about tonight is not one big pie for the district, but really splitting that into, I don't know, little pot pies, I guess. Yeah, they're not exactly round, and then taking 80% of each of those individual pies for the site, and then taking the other 20% pieces and making those the district-wide portion. That 20%, or actually it's 16.5% because 3.5% has to be allocated to after-school or extended day activities, and that was some new legislation that was put in place. And so 16.5 of that actually gets allocated back to the sites on a per pupil basis. So when you're looking at this spreadsheet, think of that 80% as staying with, 20% comes back to the district, 3.5% goes to extended day activities at the sites.
In all sites? In all 13 sites?
Well,
just the sites and schools that...
It could be summer school activities, it could be after school activities that are funded by the district, and so it's not site specific. That is a question that we had as we developed this. There are a few pieces that as we went through the resolution, we weren't quite sure where it fit. So that 3.5% could be part of the 80, and then it would be used for extended day at that particular site. Or that 3.5% could come from the other 20% and be considered a district-wide function. So that's something that that you can discuss and work through. The other piece was, as we look at each of these individual pies, and we're saying, 20% is now for district-wide programming, 80% stays at the site. There was also in the language that we were using, it says some portion would be for discretionary. So they would be working with the education team at the district level to develop a plan for how to use those funds. But we weren't quite sure what some meant. We went for 50% of that 80. So 40% allocated, 40% discretionary.
Say more about what allocated is used for versus discretionary at site.
Allocated is usually in FTE form, so teachers buying more staff, support staff, and the discretionary is more determined by the site with guidance from the district.
Is the allocated FTE, is that for class size generally, or is that specifically for underperforming students?
It kind of depends on the site. Some choose to use integration or interventionists, and so they would be working with specific students. Sites that are opting to lower class size across the board rather than have interventionists would be affecting all. So it depends what that site's determining to do. We're about half and half right now of sites using either reading and math interventionists and some that are opting to just have a lower class size. So,
I may have misunderstood your question. Could you repeat that again?
So I asked. And we also, probably there might be more people watching online, so we should do microphones as much as possible. But my question was, of the 40% that's considered allocated, is that to, what does that mean? And you said it was to FTEs, to positions, to staff members. And then the question was, okay, are those staff members then just general staff numbers to reduce class sizes? Or are they targeted staff members to serve, in particular, the students who are the subject of the comp ed legislation? And so the answer was, it's a mixture. The sites get to decide whether or not they're going to invest this money in like math and reading interventionists, or if they're going to use it for class size reduction. Is that fair?
It's part of the FTE allocation that each building works with. So whether they decide to have reading or math interventionists or social worker or other supports, they can do that with that FTE, or they can use it for class size reduction. I'd say most of them are a mix. So, and then the discretionary is in addition to that.
Can you give some examples of how discretionary money, and again, partly we have a lot of audience members here to better understand how discretionary money can or is used right now, and then secondly, again, for the public, as well as our new board members, I know this will be gone over tomorrow more, but the 12 areas that comp ed money can be used. Just again, so everyone's on the same page.
I don't have the 12 areas off the top of my head, but maybe while I'm talking for a few seconds, Doug can find that. I do want to point out, though, that just when we use the term discretionary, that applies to more than comp ed, because discretionary is meant to say that a site has discretion on how it's used. So there's also discretionary funding from Title I, from achievement and integration, so it's really any funding. There's what we call middle school referendum, which we haven't had a middle school referendum for like 20 years, but it's still a category that gives the middle schools some discretionary funding. So discretionary is meant to be money that the building has access to provide additional services. So it's not just a comp ed term. So when we say discretionary, in this conversation, I'm assuming we're just talking about comp ed discretionary. So I just wanted to be clear about that. And now Doug has 12 categories for you.
It is a list of 12. And I may not read each and every one of these in its entirety, but I'll try to give you a flavor of each one. Number 1 is direct instructional services. Number 2 is remedial instruction in reading, language arts, mathematics, other content areas, or study skills. Number 3 is additional teachers and teacher aides to provide more individualized instruction. Number 4 is a longer school day or week during the regular school year or through a summer program. Number 5 is comprehensive and ongoing staff development consistent with district and site plans. Number 6 is instructional materials, digital learning, and technology appropriate for meeting the individual needs of learners. Number 7, programs to reduce truancy, encourage completion of high school, enhance self-concept, provide health services, provide nutrition services, provide a safe and secure learning environment. That one keeps going, but I think you get a sense of that. Number 8 would be bilingual programs. Number 9 would be all-day kindergarten. Number 10 is early education programs, parent training programs, school readiness programs, kindergarten programs. 11 is extended school day and extended school year programs. And number 12 is substantial parent involvement in developing and implementing remedial education or intervention plans for a learner. And I'll stop there. Any questions about those?
I don't really have a question for Doug, so if Nora's question is for Doug, she can go first.
I have a clarification on the 12.
Okay.
Which is just that a number of these specifically address, they state, additional teachers and teacher aides to provide more individualized instruction to these learners. So they're specific to the educational needs of pupils who are underprepared or whose progress is below that of the age-appropriate level. So it's not that this money can fund additional teachers. It's that it can fund additional teachers for these particular identified students. So I just wanted to clarify that about the 12. We should have a nickname for these 12 rules.
Just a quick comment back to Nora is I would think that's true but then I would think that when you can hire additional staff to take care of students that are underprepared, that allows more staff for a significant other population, so it's a win-win for us, I would think. But my question goes back to Superintendent Grunstad's pie chart and my math skills. And you, Doug, you can chime in too. So I never really understood that you look at the entire monies coming to us from the state for our free and reduced lunch population, and then you cut that in half. So is there an advantage to that mathematically to take all of the money, cut it in half, so 50% goes to schools that are underserved and 50% is discretionary for us to place in other places, or is it a better use of money to look at it in the 13 different pies that are driven up there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's your meeting. And actually, I oversimplified a bit. We actually split it into elementary and secondary in the past, and then so there were actually two pies, not just one. Sorry. I'm not sure if there's a benefit over one over the other, because we're working with two different sets of numbers here. When I first started, and we've been making reductions for about 20 years in Duluth. One of the first things that I did is I took the team and went down to the State Department and had some heart-to-heart conversations about, Duluth is having a really hard time. We hadn't passed a referendum at the time, and we were looking at making some really big budget cuts. And so I'd asked the commissioner to gather staff around to help us to really dive into our finances and be creative to be able to address increasing class sizes and cutting programs. And one of the areas that they talked to us about was Comp Ed, and pointed out that the statute allowed for half of those funds to be used at the district-wide level. And the team said, well, yeah, we're already there. But it was one of the things that the state helps districts to realize when they're really struggling. What I've come to realize is that once you're in the position of using those funds for this purpose, it's difficult to then back out of it, and that's where we are. And I think that we are going to make steps and start going the other way, and start pulling this money out of these funds. How we address the hole that it leaves is what we're going to be doing for the next few months together, is developing that budget. And so that's kind of where we are as a district. And knowing a little later I'm going to be talking about quite a few of the processes that we're currently in process of, referendum being one of them, and that might be a piece of all of this too. So we have a lot of pieces moving right now. I think we're moving in the right direction, but I think we have to be really mindful of the whole budget picture as we delve into this.
Member Oswald.
There's a question about, I know that curriculum is getting a piece of this comp ed pie somewhere. Can you explain to us how much of comp ed goes to fund our curriculum department? And is that source come from ALC, or is it taken from that 50% district-wide of that pie? How and where, I guess?
Sure. We saw Kevin's email on that earlier today. And the language that we were working from on that resolution says the 13 traditional sites, and so that's the worksheets that you have. All of our residentials and ALC also generate comp ed funding, and a portion of the ALC is actually for staff at the middle and high schools. So it's teachers that are teaching intervention courses in the middle and high schools, but the funding flows through ALC. So on paper, it might look like the ALC is getting that funding, but it's actually paying for the staff that's actually out at the sites. So it's staff at the sites that the sites aren't paying for. ALC is actually paying for them. The other portion of the, if we were to create another pie, that was the residentials and ALC, about half of that money goes to fund our curriculum, so materials, the intervention materials, staff training, staff in the curriculum department. And that's around, well, I can tell you, it's 900, it's in the 900,000 range.
Can I follow up, please?
Yeah.
So what we're talking about isn't necessarily going to affect the curriculum department as is from this proposal of what we're talking about today?
Right.
And then this also, what we see right now?
It could.
Okay.
That'll be part of the budget discussion. So,
Okay.
As a whole, if we're headed into a deficit, then this 921.6 would be added to that deficit amount, and we'd have to figure out how to address that together.
And then, I know in the comp ed budget that we had previously, it showed ALC's generated amount and allocated amount, and that money was missing from the budget. And I had asked if we could find out where that money went, and so obviously I think we're determining now that it goes to the curriculum department and other things. I would like to know if this number, like say, let's just say for Denfeld, if the number on here of $588,000 is what we decide to allocate at their 80%, would there be additional ALC money added to that for the ALC courses and instructors that are paid for through ALC? Or is the $588,000 it?
Okay. Too many questions at once. One, it's not just the ALC funds, it's the ALC and residentials. So we have 6 residential sites that are also a part of that, so it's not just
Okay.
ALC. The other piece is the comp ed funds wouldn't be added to the sites because the staff is paid for through ALC, but they're at the sites. So they're actually ALC teachers who are out at the sites. So that, I mean, you could say, okay, these, this number of staff at Denfeld is paid for through ALC. You could shift that on our paperwork to show that it's actually expended at Denfeld. And in fact, I've asked Peggy to kind of break that out. So split ALC into a couple of sections instead of just the ALC, so that it would be the ALC seat-based program, so kids that attend class here and the money that's spent here, and then ALC funded courses at the sites, so that we can break that out and see, this is paying for teachers that are at the sites, this is paying for teachers who are working in this building with the 100, 200 kids that are in programs here.
I'd really appreciate seeing that, because that would make it much clearer. Thank you.
Unfortunately, Peggy's not here today, or yesterday.
Thank you. I wanted to take it back a little bit to sort of a higher level discussion about this, in that I appreciate the summary that the superintendent offered, and the fact that we are all on the same page about wanting to restructure the way compensatory education has been allocated, and that none of us were here when this was set up the way it is now. We've inherited it, and we're trying to fix it. And we're trying to fix it because the community has come forward and said, the statute says this money is supposed to be for kids who are underprepared and kids who are not achieving. And we want to see that reflected in the spending. And they've discussed how that's a value choice, that where we choose to put our resources speaks to, and even how we frame how we're spending our resources speaks to our values as a district. And we want to make it very clear that we value all students, and we value bringing students up to speed who are not currently performing where they should be. So for me, it's always important to start with the statute. And we talked about the 12 ways in which this money can be spent, and we talked about the 50% provision. But I wanted to highlight that that provision says a district can allocate up to 50% of the amount of compensatory ed revenue that it receives at a site, but that money reallocated must be spent for the purposes listed before, those 12 ways to spend the money. So even if we shift 50%, it still has to specifically go to these particular areas of direct instruction, remedial instruction for these learners, additional teachers and aides to these learners, staff development to improve the staff's ability to identify these learners and provide remediation to these learners. So it's pretty darn specific and restrictive that these funds should be going to underperforming students. Like I said before, there's also early childhood and making sure all kids are prepared. And if we could, I know we're going to hear more about that tomorrow in our education committee and where we're going with our pre-K programming, but that's the long-term big step, is to make sure all of our students come in prepared. But for now, we've heard that our community wants us to stay true to the intent of the statute and express our value in allocating this money at the sites where it is generated for the students who are generating it. So that's sort of the big picture, and I really appreciate the work that Mr. Hassler put into, and Peggy put into, putting together these charts. It doesn't, I didn't see a conclusion one way or the other, or any sort of, I didn't see big red flags coming out of this saying we can't we can't move forward with the proposed 80% allocation. Is that a fair statement?
Can I address it like this? I did not understand it that we were being asked to pass judgment on this. We were asked to prepare a model that would put numbers to the proposed proposal. So, no, there was no conclusion that we formatted for this. Although I would say that one important element of this analysis is what resources, what impact would implementation of this have on our current allocation of resources for class size. And don't know if I'd say it's a conclusion or not, but based on this analysis, it shows that there would be a reduction in the amount of money that's available to support class size ratios around the district to the tune of $920,000. So as far as the conclusion goes, if it's the board's decision to implement this, we will have additional work to do to either decide how it is that we're going to look through the rest of our budget and find an additional $920,000 to shore up the staffing support that's necessary to maintain our current ratios, or whether or not we're going to choose to allow classroom ratios at buildings around our districts to increase. And certainly there's also the option of doing a little bit of both, somewhere in between.
And to clarify that, we're not eliminating positions, so to speak. We're saying that if we allocated the money as it's laid out here, there would be less available in the sites that don't generate as much comp ed for class size equalization. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, although the bottom line number here is reflective of the district as a whole. So it's a different impact on a building by building basis. And this, maybe I'm biased in saying this, I don't know that the board would want to see a building by building specific ratio in place at a building, depending on where it fit along the spectrum of comp ed revenue. So when I look at a decision that the school district would make in terms of what's our district-wide class size going to be, is that a district-wide decision, or is it a building by building aspect that may have variation? I guess you can do either of those. Where we've been in the past is we've looked to maintain an established class size ratio across the district as a whole.
Can I do one more thought, Chair Trinka? Okay. My last thought is just that I think that this decision or this discussion is important as we frame our budget discussion. And I think that this is the way to do it, to say, okay, before we sit down with the budget, our value is putting an emphasis on students who are underachieving, and so we're going to keep that money with them, and then we'll figure out how the rest of the budget is going to support that. That's how I kind of see it, big picture, working, and that making this a priority is an important statement to the community. So.
I'm looking at the very last page, page 91, and the column number 6 of the balance reallocation based on the percentage of enrollment. And I noticed that we reallocate the money that is left over evenly between all 13 sites. There is ways that we can do that to to lessen the amount of FTE lost by tweaking and playing with those numbers. Say that, if we didn't want to include some of the sites, or if we wanted to lessen their percentage of what they got of whatever it is, to play around with that money to save some more FTE is really what I'm looking at. I don't see anything specific in the resolution, the copy of at least what I have, that actually dictates how that remainder is allocated or not. So I'm open and flexible to that, and I don't know that that is dictated by the resolution anyway. So there's some wiggle room in there, and I think that that's a hopeful thing. If we needed, an extra class or an extra teacher, an FTE somewhere, that there's ways to wiggle that. And like I said, I think the resolution only speaks more to the 80% and not how the remaining 20% is reallocated, I guess is what I'm saying. Is anybody following me? Because I'm getting a lot of...
Yeah, could I respond?
Please do.
Could I respond? Yeah, there's lots of ways. That's another interpretation that we kind of made on the fly as we tried to give effect to the language of the proposed resolution. But when I look at column 6, what I see are comp ed resources that will go towards paying for staff consistent with maintaining district-wide class size ratios, and it's $917,000. Now you can choose to pick a building and say, well, let's pick 2 buildings and let's take some money away from this building and let's move it over here. You can do that, but your total is going to be $917,000. So it's not adding money. I mean, it's a zero-sum calculation. And any dollars that you take away from one building means that there is less funding support at that building for FTE to maintain class size ratios. And if you choose to shift that over somewhere else, you're just creating a gap after you've filled up a gap. Now, it could be that the building you move the money away from is a building that has a sizable amount of discretionary dollars, which that building may choose to use to replace that gap that you've just created. There's lots of moving parts to this analysis.
And if I can follow up to that, I bring that up because this isn't a perfect system by means, and it makes a lot of assumptions, and it's a great starting point. I just want to be aware that there are ways that we can work with this, even by passing a resolution that talks about the 80%. That if we need to, we can fill these holes as needed, moving towards this ideal scenario. I mean, I think this is an ideal scenario. I do, but I fully recognize that there are going to be spots that we don't have funds yet to move around to fill spots that are needed, such as at Lakewood. I mean, they need extra teachers that they don't get funding for. I recognize that. I fully understand that. And if this is a way to get those funds there that we don't have any other funds that we can move there, I think that's a way we need to look at it as a board and understand that is an equitable approach, even though it's not funding the equity evenly. And that's a funny thing to consider, because equity doesn't mean even, but this is a very equal approach we're taking here. And when we're looking at equity, it's based on need. So thank you for spelling that out, and I hope everybody understood what I was talking about.
Superintendent Gronseth.
Yeah, I saw that on Mr. Square-Brown's suggestions earlier as well, and so I was kind of looking into that. But I think if you start taking from the 20% that is allocated to the sites that traditionally get those funds and give them to sites who don't traditionally get those funds, I think that would be supplanting, because the expectation is that we're providing the same FTE ratio, so teacher to student ratio, to all schools, and then they would use their discretionary funds to build on top of that. And what you would be doing then is you would be giving the sites who received those funds a lower teacher-to-student ratio, expecting them to short back up with the money from their discretionary. So I think whatever we do there should probably be an across-the-board move. If we're moving the ratio, I think the ratio has to move all at once and let the funding follow that, so it's even. Did you follow that? Crickets.
Can I respond? No? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is your mic on because you're
It
the
is.
chair, or is your mic on because you want to talk?
Because I want to talk.
Okay, you go.
Okay. I have a couple quick questions and then a comment. Could you remind me, because these numbers aren't coming easily to my head, comp ed as a percentage of the total budget is roughly 6?
We get about $7 million, and our total budget is, for general fund, is in the 90 million range.
Right, okay. So we'll say 6-ish. That's a technical term. And one of the things, just as a point of information that I asked Mr. Hassler to do was to reach out to some of his colleagues across the state who have recently gone through statutory operating debt and see from a comp ed perspective what if they had, hindsight being 20/20, what would they have done differently? Not that I want to plan for the worst, but I think that we would be naive not to anticipate that that's a possibility. I think Member Sandstead brought up a really good point that I hadn't thought of before. One of my concerns coming into this meeting was that we're all really committed to this concept of keeping the money where it's earned and where it's generated. But we're also coming up, we don't have the full budget picture because we haven't started talking about that yet. And we don't know exactly what the referendum ask is going to be. And so how do we view this without having all of the pieces of the puzzle? But I think at 6%-ish of the budget, we have to be really mindful and thoughtful about our expenditures, money in, money out, and wanting to make sure that we have at least a neutral budget, if not putting something away for the rainy day fund. But I think I would agree that we would then go into the budgeting process with the understanding that this is the commitment that we're willing to make as a board, and needing to ask for things differently in the referendum perhaps that would help to support or offset maybe some of these potential losses. But I think what it says to our community is that we're really committed to reducing that achievement gap and to making sure that all of the children in our community succeed. And then we just work off of this financial assumption and make plans elsewhere in other parts of the budget.
It's really hard to hang on to your thoughts for the whole time, like when you're sitting here and you have that idea and then it's everybody, so hopefully. So a couple of things. I actually followed Member Oswald's comments about the 20% going, and then when Superintendent Grunts have followed up, then I lost it, so that's okay. Because, in my mind, I thought, well, yeah, if we are, in essence, willing to realign comp ed dollars at an 80%, that's going to bump up some of our underserving schools that have the students right now. That's going to give them some extra money, and so as a way to help our schools that are not don't have are the low generating schools, if we gave them the 20%, because the schools that do have the need based, that would be a way of giving our schools that are going to see a drastic drop because now they're getting 80%. They'd have more discretionary money for class size, sort of. I don't know if I added any more confusion to that, but we'll keep going there. We're having good conversation. Second, I really do like Bill's, Superintendent Gronseth's, historical kind of observations as well, that when you first came aboard, you brought your board down to the MDE. Is that where you went? Okay. And just because I do think, from my years in the district too, that historically we have operated in this manner for a long time, but now our needs have, I don't know if they've significantly changed, but they're changing and evolving, so I think it's a good time to really look hard and know all of that, and tomorrow's budget will be great. If we're going, so I like Nora's comment too about, what do we value? And I'm not, that's a real murky area and touchy-feely maybe, but so class size seems to be a major concern for all of us, and I think as I campaigned, I heard a lot about that. But yet, if class size is how we might have to really make some hard decisions, then I really want hard data on our class sizes. And I know you put something out because I saw it in my preparations, like maybe in our October or November information that the new board members were getting. Must have been November since I wasn't elected till then. But I didn't think that was as specific as I'd like. Like I think it said there's 90 fifth graders at Stowe, and then so it must be an average of 31 in a class size. But I know that that's an average, and it's not really always true. Sometimes there's 19 in one section and 33 in another. I don't know why that is, but so I'd really like some hard data on class sizes if that's going to make some difference in how we decide. And then I just have a question about, again, going back to a value, is should we be using discretionary comp ed dollars to fund curriculum? And I know, and then that goes back to Bill's comment about we were in a tough place. And so I could see, but we've got a referendum that we could frame to help us with class size and referendum, or in curriculum. So my question would be, I want to use as much comp ed money to help underperforming students in the schools that they're in.
Chair Kirby?
Thank you. I think that Member Sandsted's comment about budget reflecting values is right on. I think that's true in this arena as well as every others. And we need to know how we got here so that we know where we're moving forward. We are in a budget deficit. We may be in more. We don't know what the special ed bill, so to speak, will be from charter schools and other things. So we're not starting at a level field, so to speak. So seeing how this portends for or consequences for the district as a whole, whatever we decide, I think is important. And as someone said, we don't know that. Secondly, I'd like to say using free and reduced lunch as a measure of underachievement is not perfect by any means. There are lots of people who have free and reduced lunch who are not underperforming. And there are lots of people who bring their own lunch or buy it who are underperforming. And I think that in that respect, things like supporting curriculum or decreasing class size does help underperforming students. If we're going to give this money to underperforming students, we have to see which of the free and reduced lunch people are underperforming. Well, we can't do that. I'm not saying we can do that. I mean, if you were going to be really specific about it. But because of the measure itself is a bit murky, I think we have to be careful in saying that if we do this, this will happen. It will help, but it may not. So.
Rosie, is your light on? No. Oh, okay. I think you're up next.
Thank you. I attended the MLK rally yesterday, and one of the themes or quotes, and I'm not going to do it justice, was about the oppressed don't get what they deserve. The oppressed have to ask for it. And I know that's a very loose interpretation, but what I see here is a group of at least 10 community groups asking for what they typically haven't gotten, that they deserve, that we get the money specifically for them. And I think that we need to move in a direction absolutely towards it. I'm ready to vote for an amendment as I have read it. I have not actually seen the final version because it wasn't included in our packet, but versions that I have seen, I'm ready to vote on with the anticipation of should that cause a significant financial burden on us, we do have a chance to tweak it during our budget process. We can amend it, we can reconsider it. But I think the community now deserves to see us make a commitment, because achievement matters for everyone. And no matter what value we put on, whether it's free reduced lunch or graduation rates or MCA scores or whatever, there's no perfect system. But what we do know is that there are some schools that achieve less and some schools that achieve more. It can be a percentage base, it can be any kind of data point we can create, but that's essentially what I get out of this. And so I want to validate the people that are standing up and saying it's time to give us what we want and what we need and what we are given and have deserved. And I'm ready to move on it. And I'm ready to reconsider it if it needs to be, but I think we have a very firm, solid ground to stand on and say that we do value all of our kids and we want to support those that need the extra help. So I hope that the rest of the board seriously considers voting for this next week. And I certainly hope that if you have any issues with voting on it, that we talk about it now, or we amend it now so that we can say yes to our community that we're going to do something.
I'm going to do a little bit of a sweep up here and try to pick up some things. I can send out the latest draft of the motion since it wasn't included. We can't discuss it, of course, over email, but I can send it out. But it essentially reads that for next year, each of the 13 traditional school sites, and they're spelled out, it's the non-residentials and ALC, will receive at least 80% of the compensatory education revenue generated by the students at each site. It's fairly simple. It's like that. I don't often commend the legislature, but they actually did a pretty good job with this. And well, the money is generated based on free and reduced lunch students. It needs to be spent on kids who are underperforming. And we do actually identify those students all the time. And we can easily target these funds. So the funds don't go to free and reduced price, the students who have free and reduced price lunch. They go to kids who are underperforming or not meeting the progress level that they should be. When you're considering this, take a step back. This is not about class size issues. This is about compensatory education revenue, which is intended for underperforming kids. It's not intended for class size. That's not what it's for. And that's a presumption that this district has operated under for a decade or more. But that's just a false assumption. It's not what we need to think about when we're thinking about compensatory education. We all know I don't want to call it a meme, the image of equity versus equality, where you have the kids looking at the baseball field and they're on the same size box because they've got equality, and the shortest kid can't see over the fence. And then you see equity, and everybody can see over the fence. And think about that in terms of your class size ratios as well. I don't know that we need to go forward with the presumption that all of the class size ratios have to be the same across the district. And in fact, they're not, because sites can use discretionary money to change them, to lower them. So maybe that's not something we place a high value on going forward with our budgeting. But leaving that aside, this is about compensatory education, and 80% is a goal, but ideally, all of this money is supposed to be going to underperforming students. And so 80% is a step in the right direction, but it's not the end goal. That's where I'll leave it.
I just wanted to point out that this is currently listed as an informational item. So if you want it moved or want a resolution on there, then we need the direction to do that.
I certainly do want it as a action item.
And I'll back that. I think we can do a lot of asking for more information, but for me the bottom line is we've consistently seen students of color, students living in poverty based on their free and reduced price lunch, a higher percentage of certain students at certain schools underachieving, and we need to look at things differently and try to do things a little differently. And that's going to take some risk on our part, and I think it's ultimately the right thing to do.
I need a parliamentarian. How do you change an informational item to an action item? Do you have to do that at the actual board meeting, or is that something that we get nods from? How do we?
My understanding is that Member Sandsted could have just offered it as a motion at the meeting, so I don't know that it necessarily has to be anything except her submitting it for an agenda item, or to amend the agenda right when we get to the meeting to include it as a resolution. So
that's what I thought. I thought maybe you have to do that at the meeting.
But
at the board meeting,
you're absolutely free to offer the resolution during when the discussion of the agenda item by pulling it too. So, thank you.
Thank you. One quick question: how does wanting to make sure that strategies are aligning, making sure that the conversations that we're having are being really well informed by the work, for example, that Mr. Howes is doing, and there isn't any potential for, I don't want to be duplicating efforts. Our resources are so thin as it is. So is there, I agree with Member Gorham's point that, you can think these things to death, and the reality is we need to move. But is there benefit in making sure, in getting insight and input from Mr. Howes as well, or do you feel like, does the committee think that we're pretty set with the amount of information he's already provided?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking the group as a whole. I know that there had been some talks too about potentially doing some listening sessions in the community around this, but the reality is we do have to move. So, Chair Kirby, I think you were next.
Well, I was just going to ask Member Sandsted to make that motion. It's fine, but can you send out the thing ahead of time? It'd just be nice. I will. Thanks.
I was just going to comment. I know that Superintendent Gronseth can speak to William Howes' role as the Education Equity Coordinator. His achievement and integration plan is set, and it's something that his sole focus is overseeing. So, yes, that is. He has lots of cool strategies and knowledge and things to share, and working on the equity framework is part of all of what you're talking about, I believe, but also what his office is doing is already planned out and available for anybody to see, but it mainly focuses on Myers-Wilkins because they're our racially identifiable school, and so it doesn't necessarily affect every student in our system, but more focused at that one site.
So my question would be I like Member Sandsted's observation that if we have this motion from the get-go when we talk with our budget tomorrow and we're looking at projections and where that we're already in the mindset that this is something we want to move towards, I think that's a smart thing. But when we make a motion, I still would like to have listening opportunities during our budget talks. I still would like to hear from other entities and groups, feedback, whether it's formally at a work session, committee session, or whether it's individually talking with our other leadership about how money allocated is going to affect their particular site. I think, wouldn't there be opportunity then in the budget process? I think one of the things I thought would be an advantage, and again, I'm just thinking, I could be very much rethought, but I was thinking that if we if we worked on this motion at our January meeting and got it into our framework for our budget, that then we work with that. And then if it doesn't seem like it is doable at 80%, maybe we can go to 75%. I don't know, but I just thought if we put it out there in January, like I think there's some movement to do, that we still then go through the process of listening sessions, meeting sessions, and we can make amendments or we can restructure. That's my question to the board.
I don't have an answer to that, but we've had many conversations as both the business side and the educational side, and I know I wouldn't want to assume to speak for Mr. House, but I know that he's supportive of moving in this direction. As far as Member Lofalt's questions or comments, I think Member Lofalt, sorry. You could either accept it or pass a resolution, and then if need be, like Member Oswald suggested, you could revisit it at a later time, or you could shift it and direct us to develop budgets that incorporate this, and then work within those options. But either way, you can revisit it if you didn't like the options at the other end. Right now, we don't have the implications in front of us, and don't have the feedback from everybody, and so maybe those things will shift in the next few months as we go through this process. But you always can revisit things.
Member Sandstead, and then I think we're probably going to wrap up this portion of the discussion.
I was just going to say we can revisit things, and I think Robert's Rule says that if you vote for something, you can bring it back up, for reconsideration. So, and that, we're a board, we can always change.
Great. So I think in terms of follow-up pieces, then we'll look for the proposed language from Member Sandstead, and then this will be on the board agenda at our next board meeting.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, and partly for the public as well as, so tomorrow we have a committee of the whole meeting, and that is where we will get a lot of background on all of our revenue sources, and I don't know how deep the discussion is going to be in terms of school by school, but certainly having a more comprehensive understanding of our budget. And I know from going through this for 4 years, that first committee of the whole meeting as a board member, I think there may be questions, thoughts, ideas that come from that as well. But I would welcome the public to come and understand better our district-wide budget as well at that committee of the whole meeting. It is open to the public to observe while the discussion would be amongst our board and our staff. But, I know for me, it's really important that I'm looking holistically, if you will, at our budget and understanding it better. And with 3 new board members, I think tomorrow will be helpful as well, because this is just one piece of it.
Great. Thank you for that, Member Loeffler-Kemp, and thanks to everyone who's with us here in the audience, too. So that was a great discussion. Looking forward to continuing that. Moving on, let's hop back to the financial report. So we're starting on page 4, and I will turn it over to Mr. Hessler.
The financial report documents in your packet are following the format that we have used in the past. within our business office, we've been doing a lot of evaluation, and while this format is what we've typically provided you in the past, I'd like to give you a prediction that we're going to be coming to you in the not too distant future with some reformatting of this. For those of you that are seeing this for the first time, it's a lot of information. For those of you who have been seeing this for months or years, it's a lot of information. And our goal in terms of how we're looking to reformat this is to give some higher level summary information so you have a better sense of really the flow of what's happening on a month-to-month basis, and also to give you a sense of, in any given month, are we on track? Are we on track with our proposed expenditures? Are we on track with the revenues that we predicted would be there to support our budget? And my judgment would be that our existing documents don't answer those questions, or if they do, they make it exceedingly difficult for you to draw those conclusions. So as we move forward in the coming months, I'm not sure if we're just going to change the format all at once, or if we're going to share some of those documents with you and get some input to see if that appears to be meeting your needs. Whether or not we do it all at once or whether we get your input in advance, certainly I would appreciate any input that you'd have. And if we do need to make some modifications in future months to better serve your needs, that's what we'd like to do. So that's pretty much how I would address our existing financial statements. If you have any specific questions about what you see there, be happy to hear from you on that issue.
Do we have any way, and I asked this question last week at our school board training where we learned all about school financing in 90 minutes. If there's a way to, and part of this is a question and part of it is have you done this before, is taking a look at, as we're thinking about budgeting, what type of multiplier we want to consider putting into the budget for unforeseen costs specific to the special education reimbursements. As we think about moving into our next year's budget, is there a safety net that you create, that you build in there, wiggle room, or I don't know what you want to call it, so that we're not, contingency. There's a number of different metaphors too we could use there, but is that something that you currently do?
We do have some contingency built in. It's probably not as much as one might like to have. I think it's somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000, which is not a lot in the context of our overall budget. Moving through the agenda, are there any questions specifically to any of the topics that fall under financial report? We have APU projections that show up there as well. That's if you want to go to page 32, and I would say that this is also a document that may be due for a little bit of an update. There's a lot of information packed on this page. I'm on page 32. What we try to do here each and every month of the school year is give you an update on what our current enrollment is. So this is titled, the January 2018 APU, PU projection report. So you see in that top area, you see a January enrollment column. So as of the start of January, that's the number of students that we had in enrollment at each of our grades. And then things get a little bit complicated. but our intent is good. What we're trying to do here is, knowing what we know in January, because we know that's the number of students that we have enrolled, what does history tell us about what we will end up the year with? Because the way our funding works through our state sources of revenue, it's not so much what your student enrollment is at the start of the year in September. It's not so much what it is in January. It ends up being a number that reflects your year in its entirety. The progression to PU column is a big, long decimal there for you. And I will tell you that this is based on history that allows us to move from what we know in January to what we will end up the year with. So, for example, just looking at the very first line there, the kindergarten, the 615 students in enrollment, history would tell us that we will end up the year with a little bit more than 607 of those students. That's a fairly stable number. You see similar stability through most of the elementary. Grades 1 and 3, grades 1 through 3 there, you see some fall off, but not a lot. Typically, we will see more erosion in our numbers as we get into the secondary grades and most significantly as we get into the high school grades. That's what history tells us. History is not always right, but in terms of a month-by-month snapshot of here's what we know, here's what history tells us, here's what we think we will end up the year with, that's the flow of that information. And skipping over a lot, just for the sake of brevity, when you get to the bottom of the page, we total up a projected total APU. And that, the APU, I skipped over too much. The enrollment numbers we started with were just counting a child as one. Just counting a child as one. When it comes to funding, that's not how it all works. When you get into the secondary grades, we have a PUW column, and what that is a weighting. So the grade 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 students are weighted as 1.2. So in terms of the number that will ultimately determine our final fiscal year 18 funding for state calculation formulas that we work with, we need to factor in that weighting. And right now, although a figure is circled which somewhat obscures, the projected total APU that we have right now is about 8879, which is a good thing for a couple reasons. It's greater than what last year's end of the year additional pupil unit was, which was an 8776, almost an 8777. And it's also somewhat greater than what we would have anticipated as we started out the year. So this page right now is showing some good news for you. And we hope that this growth, because this is reflective of growth in our enrollment compared to last year, and that's growth that this school district has not seen in quite some time. It's January and that growth is still here. Obviously there will be students leaving us over the course of the year, and there will be students enrolling with us before the end of the year. And so when we get to the end of the year, we'll know these numbers better. One thing that still continues to amuse me is I've been in this district now for a little bit over a year, and this information flows through our Mars coordinator. Cattery does a great job with this information, but I remember getting an email from Cattery in early January last year to let me know that our student counts have been finalized for the 2015-16 school year in January of 17. It's like, oh, really? We got that final number now, did we, Cattery? And it's not a reflection on Cattery. That's just the process. And as you get into the summer months and into the fall, on a month-by-month basis, not much is changing, but there is information going back and forth between school districts as to some student that might have moved and enrolled at a different school district, and sometimes our numbers don't catch up to that right away. So there's not a lot of change after the school year is over, but there is some revision in that, and I continue to find amusement that it takes that long to get our final numbers, but that's the process. Any questions about the APU report?
I have one.
Yes, please.
What's MFR in the end of year APU? What is MFR?
MFR is an MDE.
What is it?
Go ahead. I was going to say it's at the bottom of the page. I had the same question.
Oh, I didn't look at the bottom.
Minnesota funding report.
Yeah, thanks.
That's an MDE. Yes.
Would we be right in assuming that with the projection at the bottom of this page that you've circled, that would reflect in some kind of reimbursement and money coming from the state like next December, almost like what we got a couple weeks ago, like a Christmas present?
The thing about student counts is that we recount every day, and the projected total is what we're hoping is our average for the year. And so when the year is all over, and then they continue to adjust and adjust and adjust and adjust until they're all done adjusting, till maybe be December or January of next year, the payments come to us in chunks, and so those final payments could come to us next December or January when those numbers are finalized. So we get payments along the way, but not the whole thing. And so at the end, there's some adjustments like we saw last month.
And if I could add a little bit to this, we report a number to MDE, I believe, in August, which is what we expect. And that's how they start out our funding. And we had opportunity to report another number, I think, in October and another number in December. We reported a number in December, which, the August number was before the first child walked through the schoolhouse door. And when those days came and kids were coming into our buildings, and we were very encouraged to see the increased enrollment, the money didn't track with that. And so, because though we're counting kids every day, MDE is not requesting updated information from us every day. So we've most recently reported an update in December, and based on that, we should see a change in our funding, but we haven't seen, we get payments, I believe, twice a month. We haven't seen any changes in our January payments. I'm really looking forward to that changing, but that's, as Bill says, that's a cash flow thing. When it's all said and done, our total final APU will generate dollars for us, and there is some chance, and it's not some chance, there is a real good chance that we will receive monies after our current fiscal year is over relating to this school year. And so that's one of the challenges anytime we go through an audit, that even though your fiscal year is over, even though your school year is over, we don't have final calculated funding amounts from the state. And so that audit that was discussed previously, that audit has to reflect what we know as of that point in time, and then any future adjustment, which could be an increase, and then in this scenario, our current funding is not equal to what it should be based on really where we are on enrollment now. But as the funding catches up to us, that'll be an increase. Certainly, it's possible as these numbers go for there to be a reduction in funding if there's an adjustment that causes the funding to go down as well.
I would just say I think you could make this more user-friendly for us.
Okay.
As in when, I think the superintendent explained it, that the projected total is budgeted annually. We all went, oh. So, yeah. it could be streamlined, and that would be more useful, I think. And also maybe compared to numbers a year ago might be a useful sort of.
This does show numbers from a year ago, because on that far right column
Yes.
is the 16-17 numbers.
And is that just from January of a year ago? Or is that
It's reflective of the end of year EOY.
Okay.
End of year APU.
Great.
And we're talking a lot about this, but this is a good conversation. That projected APU number, which is right next to the MFR column, that projected APU does not represent our count in January. It reflects our count in January, adjusted by that progression factor in an effort to arrive at what we think we're going to end up the year with. So if history tracks with every decimal you see on that page, the projected APU column would represent our end of year for 17-18. Now, don't lose any sleep over this, because we'll come back to this next month, and we'll have February enrollment. We'll have different progressions, and so we'll continue to see these numbers evolve as we go through the end of the school year. I don't think we've talked this much about APU, and
We appreciate it, though. I think it will help, too, with communicating with the public. So I think certainly getting feedback from us, what we would like to see, but then also running it by some folks who, with an outside perspective, might be great, too. Member Lofra-Kemp?
It might be helpful on your little diagram or cheat sheet, whatever, that little corner thing, if you included just a brief on the weighted, just because I know that's confusing and it gets brought up every time how the elementary, middle, and high school are weighted, so just maybe a little explanation. And this is the reason why we tell our kids, yes, you have to go to school for at least the first hour of the day or more because of when the kids are counted, right? And it's good to remind families of that as well.
It's by the hour. You got to go all day, every day.
okay, looking at the larger agenda, unless there are any other questions under the financial report topics, I would suggest we move forward. There are no bids, RFPs, and quotes to report on at this time, so I think we can pretty easily move past those. And that takes us into the policies and regulations, and perhaps if I could get some assistance from Mr. Spooner. I've got some documents I'd like to hand out which reflect some minor changes from what was in your packet. And let me give you the, let me frame this discussion from the standpoint that based on, I believe, our board meeting a month ago, there was a consensus of the board who wanted to see each of these policies that were on the December agenda. Did you have enough there, Dave? Okay. There was a consensus that let's have each and every one of those policies incorporate the term bylaw, specifically in the context of each of those policies. And so that's what we were planning to come back to you with, and that's what was in your packet. Now, when we look through those policies, I think this would be an opportune time for us to raise a couple of other issues with you as suggested modifications to these policies. And in terms of the handout that you've just received, let's start by looking at 203.5. This is a policy / bylaw that has been in place. And when this was first adopted, we were adopting, I believe, the MSBA model policy. And the MSBA model policy, on that first page, there was a note in brackets under B, under the Section 3 on procedures, under B, note to the effect of the Commissioner of Administration, and it goes on from there. Well, a note isn't, it's explaining, it's not part of a policy, it's just an explanation. It was MSBA's explanation. I'm not saying it's a bad explanation, but I think in terms of a proposed cleanup, a note like this probably should come out. You may disagree with that, and that's what this process is about, but that would be a cleanup that we would propose. We would also propose the insertion of some language in C and in D, just to address some of the realities that we think have worked in terms of our past policies. Moving on the back of the first page, we're now moving to policy/bylaw 208. And there was language there in terms of having access to a policy manual. And what we would propose there would be that the language that appears just below the language that's being stricken out, that a paper copy would be available in the superintendent's office, and certainly electronic copies are available through the district webpage. And the last thing we would suggest as a revision would be on policy/bylaw 214. The language in terms of reimbursement for travel and mileage rate is a mileage rate set by the Internal Revenue Service. We as a district adopt what it is that the IRS issues. We don't go out on our own and establish mileage rates. So I would offer those revisions to you. And again, I'd go back to the beginning. The real point of having these on your agenda this month was to make sure that bylaw was clear and unambiguous on each of these individual policies, and I think that is accomplished. And while doing that, I think it'd be an opportune time for a little bit of cleanup as I've summarized on each of those issues. Happy to address any questions you might have.
Just a quick point of clarification. I asked Superintendent Gronseth about this earlier because I was confused about why we were doing this. And I know we talked about it earlier in the month, but I was caught up in the excitement of being recently elected. Just as a reminder, changes to a policy require less votes than changes to a bylaw. And so looking over, like reimbursable expenses at the IRS rate is standard operating procedure and doesn't make, I don't think is as big of a deal. But I think potentially the agenda piece may or may not be based on feedback from other folks. So, but I just wanted, as we're thinking about making this change, it does require, changing a bylaw requires, is it a supermajority and you have to have everyone in attendance and you have to be wearing yellow socks or something? I mean, it's pretty prescriptive. Right.
I do want to point out that this is for out-of-state travel by school workers.
Yeah.
Not just standard.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
I can clarify part of that is that part of the argument when we were switching over to MSBA policies is that we were eliminating bylaws, and so my insistence of including the new policy as a bylaw because we were eliminating bylaws to create that new policy. It didn't apply to every 200 policy that is in here, but this is Mr. Hassler's way of remedying that, and I don't necessarily have any problem with that. I just would want to, if other members have an issue with just doing a blanket bylaw, then I would suggest we look back in our minutes and figure out which ones were individually replacing bylaws and do that. But I'm just fine with the blanket thing. The next point I have is right on the 203.5, right on the front, and this is kind of funny because I dared Jackie before the meeting that she should be listening, because I just want to point out that item C, this happened, I believe, the first or second meeting when I was seated 2 years ago, is that we changed the 3-day period to 4 days. And so to get our materials 4 days in advance, and we currently get them on Friday, which is only 3 days in advance. So it's not technically meeting our policy. So I'm just, if you look at 5 or 4:30 on Friday, it's Saturday at 4:30, Sunday at 4:30, and Monday at 4:30. That's 3 days for a business committee agenda. So just saying that either we change the policy back or we get it a day earlier. I just would like to be in compliance with whatever we're trying to do. And my third and final question is on 208. If we're eliminating the whole paper policy manual, for those of us that have paper policy manuals, are we going to continue updating those binders? And what do we do with it? How do we bring it back to Melinda? Do we just recycle it at home? What do you want us to do with it?
The 3-day, 4-day, one of the things we noticed too was that we're required to give a 3-day notice for a meeting, but this would be getting you the materials before we know we're having a meeting sometimes. So at the 3, 4, 3 would probably be better. We do try to send out the packets or release them electronically on Thursday evening, but probably not earlier than 4:15 because we're usually still working on it at that point. What was the other one? Yes. Yeah, the change in language was because it said that there was going to be a paper copy at each of the buildings, and we don't have those. I think board members got them at the request of board members. You can keep it as a memento, or you can bring it back and we can recycle it as well.
I don't really want to elongate all things either, but I did do some research too on this policy versus bylaw and saw the same concerns that Member Trinka, that they're not interchangeable. And if we're going to stick with a bylaw, it is a little bit more sophisticated than maybe we even. So are we going to change bylaw throughout all of our policy updates? Because we're going through the 200s right now. Just 200s.
The reason you have several in front of you is because it came up last month. It was one of the 200s to change it in the title of the actual bylaw or the policy. The section says bylaw, but to get it into the title of each individual item within that section, we needed to bring back the policies that we'd already cycled through. So really we're just adding the bylaws. You wouldn't normally get this many all at once. So it's just the 200s, not every section.
And is this an okay thing for all of you? This isn't a concern that we're changing? I shouldn't be concerned?
I don't think we're changing, because previously we've shown all of these policies identified as a group as being bylaws. That was my understanding. In the 200s.
I'm new.
Okay. Do you have anything else?
No.
Okay. Great. So we'll vote on these later in the month, right? Okay.
In the next section, we move into contracts, change orders, and leases. And we do have a change order relating to the work at Rockridge School. I believe that Mr. Spooner had sent an email to board members towards the end of last week, kind of giving some additional context and framing the circumstances that that change order was coming out of. Fortunately, Mr. Spooner is here with us today. It is a recommendation to approve a proposed change order for Krause Anderson Construction Company in the amount of $77,457.77 for a new revised construction contract amount of $2,548,512.45. Any questions?
I just wanted to say thank you for preparing us well for this and explaining it thoroughly. I appreciate that and all of the thought that went into this.
Thank you. I knew it would be kind of confusing, and I drafted my cover letter for the change order, and it didn't quite tell the whole story, so I felt I should send an email and provide some additional information, since this was a new way of procuring construction off NJPA. And it's worked out very well, and I just want to kind of give you a little bit more information. It almost equates to Vikings winning on Sunday, is how almost.
With this being a little bit more of a miracle.
Yeah, this being more of a miracle. Everybody really pulled together. The contractors in Duluth were just wonderful. If the superintendent and Doug asked me to do a project this quickly again, I'd probably have to tell them I don't think I could get it done, because it probably wouldn't happen. A boiler that takes 12 weeks came in 2 weeks. Doors that take 12 weeks came in 4 weeks. It was just, everything came into line, and it just, I don't think it would ever happen again. But the contractors that participated, it was just a great team, and we're not done yet. We have site work to do this spring when the ground thaws, and we are budget compliant with the $3 million that both Mr. Hassler and I indicated we would need every bit of, and we're still compliant and under that figure. I will have another change order next month, and I will have a deduct change order next month, but we are compliant and it's moving forward, and teachers and students are very happy with the facility, and it's very impressive, and I think you'll all be impressed when you have the tour. Our open house, I think, is in February or March, I'm not sure. So, thank you.
I just wanted to echo Member Stanstead, and also really appreciate that we don't have to argue about if it's too much or if we're spending too much money or we could get it cheaper, and I'm very thankful that those days are gone in this contract, and I hope they're gone permanently, that with this new method of bidding and procuring things, that it's straightforward and simple, and I'm very thankful for that.
It's a unique way to procure construction. Both Carrie and I have been watching it for probably 2 years. It's taken off throughout the United States. The Metro's been using it. It's Brainerd, St. Cloud, they've used it for a couple of years. And this project was the first project that really fit, it was really the only way we could do it. And it's similar to buying a Chromebook off a contract, a NJPA contract. Everything is pre-priced, so I don't have to fight and argue with contractors, and I don't have to come to the school board and say, this was my negotiation. I mean, that's established. Anybody can look at a task catalog that's probably 8 feet of paper if you stood it up on the floor. I mean, everything is pre-priced, so I can appreciate your comments. It's good for all of us.
Yeah, I just, if you would please share, I know you're in contact with a lot of the different contractors in that, and more than we obviously should be, and so please share with them a huge thank you for working so efficiently and over the top on weekends and things like that as well. So thank you. It was great to get your email last week.
Seeing no other questions, we'll move forward. Under C, on leases, there is a placeholder for the Hills lease. For board members that have been around for a while, this has been a continuing placeholder. And we are trying to finalize the square footage space at the Hills that the Woodland Hills staff is using. And we've also had a recent circumstance where the Hills is going to be funding the installation of, I believe, some sprinklers.
Vandal-resistant sprinkler heads, so a student can't take a book or something and hit the sprinkler head and flood the building. It was something we would probably have done and we wanted to do, but it would push us too close to that $3 million limit, and I don't want to go there at this point, and they offered to pay for it with a reduction in their lease payment to correspond to that cost.
So our lease document will be incorporating those modifications. We also have a place, as we move into resolutions, every month we have an acceptance of donations resolution. Not going to address anything specifically there unless there's any questions. Oh, okay. You want to carry the ball on that?
Yeah. This is, we talked about it at agenda setting, and unfortunately it didn't get on the agenda, but I do have an additional proposal for consideration. So with your permission, I'd like to go ahead with that.
Let's do it.
Pass these out.
Is this an expenditure? What is this? Where is this following?
It's contract. Actually, it would be, it is within my signing authority, but I wanted to talk to you about it because it's more of a global conversation. So one side of this says ISD 709 planning processes, and the other side says multi-year planning. I'm going to start on the planning processes side. We are engaged in several levels of planning and conversation that have to do with our strategic direction and our short and long-term futures. The first one is what I'm calling equity conversation here. When we're talking about developing an equity tool, and that William Howes has agreed to facilitate that process. And so they've been underway, and as we head into having more community input on that tool, we're looking to kind of have a presentation and a tool in place by March, and recognizing that that is only the beginning of that process that would have implementation and training to follow. We have also had the secondary options task force working for over a year now on exploring what started out as a 7-period day conversation and has now undergone a lot of research into different models and grade periods and blocks and many different options that could be included in that. And they're hoping to wrap up those conversations probably within the next month and have recommendations for us to consider moving forward. We're also in the middle of the budget process. As we're starting off tomorrow with the first committee of the whole, we'll be having more committee of the wholes to have discussions about our revenues, our expenditures, how we might address a deficit or a surplus, if that happens. I always want to be optimistic. We're not projecting a surplus, I'm just saying that. But then having a draft budget in place by late March, early April, and then, of course, as required, a final budget before the end of June There's also been some discussion tonight, even about having a school board retreat and doing planning and goal setting, and I'm not sure on the timelines on that, so I kind of plunked a couple diamonds in there as possible dates and then implementation of that. And last year we also started working on the referendum and what that might look like, and all of these pieces that have been before this are a part of that discussion as well. And as we begin developing that, it's really important that we have really strong data for all of these pieces. And so each of these pieces have ways of us going out to the community and coming back to you and going back out to community, working with staff, working administration in all of these processes. On the back is the multi-year planning. It kind of carries this out for the next 10 years, showing that equity is an ongoing conversation, that the secondary options, we would look at whatever the recommendations are, and then a year of planning, and then it would be implemented fall of 19, possibly. Curriculum review has been planned out for the next 10 years. These are the areas that would be reviewed. On the bottom, it indicates it's a 3-year process. The first year is reviewing, the second year for either assessing, adapting, or adopting a new curriculum, and then the third is implementation and monitoring. Right now, we just replaced the Wonders reading curriculum, and we're in that implementation and monitoring year of that, and the arts are slated to be next. Budget, of course, is a yearly cycle, and then a reserve, a plan to build up the reserves as part of that budget plan, with the hopes that within 5 years we would have 5%, and 10 years we'd have 10%. Those might be goal areas that the board considers as we're going into this. Of course, if we have property sales, it could speed up that process considerably. And then, again, the referendum, which sunsets at the end of this year, and then she thinks I said, hi, Siri, with a vote next fall, and then that pay year being FY20. And then the question along with that is, do we go for 5 years? Do we go for 10 years? And how much is it? And like I said, all of that requires some really good data. And as part of that referendum building process, when we're in that referendum design segment in, say, March, April, May, is when we really need to have feedback from the community about what are those priorities, what are they willing to invest in, how much are they willing to invest, and how long would they like to invest for. And one way to get that information is by working with a data company. So I looked into a couple of different companies and got proposals from companies that work specific to education and educational referendums, and helping to design referendum questions and strategy around all of that. And would like you to consider working with the Morris Leatherman Company, previously Decision Resources. They are a Minnesota-based company. They're in Minneapolis. We have worked with Morris Leatherman in the past, although they were Decision Resources when we worked with them before. They've since changed their names, although it's the same people that are involved. Another company we considered was Springstead. We have gone to some training with Springstead, and they also provided a proposal. Upon looking at the proposals, the Morris Leatherman offered more value, a larger sample, more questions, and more support in the form of strategy afterwards. And so to get into the queue, if you will, to have them work with us, because there's a period of developing questions and then a period of them taking polls and creating a report. If we want that information to be available to us in April or May, when we're really designing that referendum, we need to engage with them now to be able to have that information down the line.
I have a comment and a question. Member Lofeld and I had the opportunity to chat with a number of districts who have recently successfully gone through a referendum at our training last week, and the first question everyone asks was, do you have data? And so I think, data is king, data drives decisions. My question is, do you have access to, looks like there's some sort of sliding cost based on the number of questions, and there's associated costs with that. Do you have that information? I can't imagine we're going to ask 50 questions to folks. So I'd be curious to, as we think about kind of total cost, if they must provide some sort of
Yes, I asked both about the number of questions asked, and they said 50 was the minimum that they would consider or recommend.
Really?
Yeah, and that the 625, they could go with less than 625. However, your accuracy rate, your range, varies considerably if you go below that for the size of our community. I kind of had the same response. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I guess to piggyback off of that, do we identify 625 families and then someone gets called up and they don't want to participate? Do they count in that 625, or is this 625 guaranteed people with participation?
625 guaranteed responses, and surprisingly, when my phone rings and I hear that pause, I very often hang up. They have, I believe it was in like 95% engagement rate with their calls, and it is landlines and cell phones. People are generally interested in education and want to provide feedback in education, and so perhaps that's why they're more likely to engage than in winning a cruise to the Bahamas, right?
For that credit card I don't have.
Yeah. Your credit card is not in danger.
Just saying. And I guess my other question is that it's listed as $20,000 for the 625 survey. Do we have $20,000 to dedicate towards something like this?
The thought was that we would be funding a portion of this out of our communications budget, and the other would come from a contingency for the board as part of your work. So we do have ways to fund it.
Okay.
I would say that the investment is really necessary to have a well-designed referendum. They actually recommended having 2 different polling times, and I said, well, I think we need to just focus on one at the end. They preferred to have one like last spring and this spring, and then compare the differences, but I suggested just going with the one instead of both.
Okay, and again, it's 625 households, not families, just to clarify that to everybody. And then I'm sorry if I missed this, but kind of what time frame are we, you need us to pass this now so we can move this, right? I mean, the time frame.
Right. There are several weeks of planning, so as soon as we engage with them, we would start talking about our questions, all the processes that we're involved in, the things that could be questions, and then they do their research and develop questions and come back and work with us. And then the polling would take place over the course of several weeks, and then they develop a report and come to us around that April or May time. Okay. And as I said, technically this is within our signing authority, but because it is a report that comes to you in the form of data, and it would be discussed in a public meeting, I wanted you to be involved in the decision-making process of that.
And then just to follow up, I just want to mention from working on many referendums over the years in this district, this is a really important piece to our success, is this polling.
Quick question. Do you have a list that you can send us of other districts in the state that have used them for their, I'm guessing that those were maybe some of the references that they gave you too, so we can.
They didn't provide me with that, but I can certainly get it for you.
Be interesting. And I think I'm glad you figured out where you're going to pull the money from, because I think I think we can't afford to not do it. I would just want to make sure we could get moving as soon as possible, because that window is starting to get pretty tight.
Because we've been in conversation with them, we are kind of on hold in their queue. They know that it's being discussed by the board currently, and that there would be a decision next week. So we have a spot reserved pending your decision.
I am just wondering about time frame for our actual proposal that we're going to put on the ballot. When do we have to have that finalized?
There are statutory requirements of that, and I want to say it's July. It's summer, so. Maybe I want to be done by July.
Smart. And just a point of clarification, are you asking us to vote on this at our next meeting, or because it's under your signing authority, if seeing no major objections?
It could go either way. We could add it to the agenda for the board meeting. You can't really vote in a committee to be able to say, just go ahead and do it. How would you like to approach this?
I guess I'd like to have it appear as an agenda item for kind of a number of reasons, with the public and transparency and thinking about referendums. But I'm happy to hear other people's opinions.
I think it should be on the agenda too, for that reason the public should know, but in the meantime, you could let them know that it looks good. I mean, I think with the time frame, then with our place in the queue, that we need to keep that, so.
Okay, so it'll be on the next agenda. And we'll have access to some of that information, that supplementary information ahead of that meeting, right? Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? On the NSBA website, there is a list of the referendums that passed and failed this fall, and so there is more referendum information there if people want to kind of compare districts, I guess, and just more information on referendums in general.
Last but not least.
I have a question about something else, a different topic, if that's okay.
Does it fit under?
It's about an expenditure contract. I just didn't want to make sure that the discussion on this topic topic is finished.
I think we're good.
Okay. On page 83, it lists all of our expenditure contracts, and I just saw the one about the Duluth Congregational Church buying 45 parking spots for students at East, and because I can't seem to find the contract attached to that anywhere, I'm curious about, are these for church kids that go to East? I mean, why are they buying parking spots for students?
I believe we're talking about a parking lot that is owned by the church that we have historically made use of, and so we've had agreements with them in past years, and this was just an update on that. So it's nothing new. We've had access to that parking right across the street from the school, I believe, even though it's not a school property, and so this continues that.
So we're just paying them for the rental of those spaces, is
Right.
what we're saying? It's not the church paying us?
No.
Got it.
It's an
I
expenditure
wanted to get
contract.
that clarification.
We are paying
made. Yeah,
them.
thank you.
Yes.
If I could add to that, that the funds to pay for that come from the funds collected for parking permits.
Great. Not yet. Are you done, Doug? With all of your updates?
Depends on what you mean by done. I know that Mr. Spooner has his monthly document on facilities management and capital project status report. And I would also not want to fail to point out that in the last board, or actually in the organizational day meeting, there were a number of questions concerning the contractual authorization limits, and I understood that the board wanted me to seek out information from other school districts, and I have done so and compiled that information. And I think within that report, which really reflects school districts that are about our size, some a little smaller than us, some a little larger, between 7,000 and 12,000 enrollment, I was able to get information on all but one of those school districts, so about 17 school districts are part of the report that I provided to you. And you'll notice that one school district has the same contractual limit, that'd be Roseville. Some had limits at 50,000, some had 100, some have no limit at all as long as it's within the approved budget. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that information.
Thank you for pulling that together.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to say thank you too, as I know it reflects my request. In rewatching the material, I do see there was a lack in my communication, that I was more focused on our district being in the financial predicament that we are recently in, that we have issues that we need to take care of, and it had less to do with these districts and what they do, but I am more than happy to accept the board's decision on that. And it is interesting to find out that there's no limit for a lot of these places, which kind of scares me a little bit.
Which we're not proposing. Just wanted to.
Except for the policy update, I believe, right?
That's a future item.
Oh, that's a future item. Okay.
We're going to talk about next week.
I'm a rookie here. Great. Well, you did send out the legislative platform. Aren't we meeting on that?
There's a placeholder.
Oh, yeah, there is. I'm not totally crazy.
I had sent this out, I don't know, a while ago, like last week. This is meant to be a working draft for you. I happened to make some copies in case, it was a week ago. It's hard to remember. We do have a meeting that Melinda is arranging with our area legislators. That'll be an open meeting with all of you to kind of go over our legislative priorities. And feel free to get any thoughts back to me so I can continue to revise this. The final product will have, more pictures and be a nice design. And this is a working draft. I started with last year's priorities, and if appropriate, I moved them forward. I included kind of some verbiage from the MSBA resolutions that you had passed last month. I've also looked at other MSBA, MASA, which is the Minnesota Association of School Administrators, the Metropolitan School District Association, Minnesota Rural Education Association. Many of them have these two areas as their main priorities. I feel like they're appropriately placed in the beginning. So any feedback you have would be appreciated.
My question about the mental health professionals listed is that, we're hearing a lot about school counselor ratios in Minnesota being one of the worst in the nation for that ratio. Is our school counselors part of the mental health professional goal, or can we add school counselors into there? Because if we have more school counselors, that frees up more people for mental health professionals to work with, because they're all, helping kids in general. Or could that be a separate thing, because we don't want to overtax our few and far between school counselors that we do way more than what they need to do, and don't get to interact with students as much as do paperwork and testing and scholarships and things. So I would really hope that we can include them somehow in that verbiage.
I believe that it was purposefully not specific to counselors, because it could also be social workers who engage in that work. And so I think the legislation was left open originally for that purpose, so it wouldn't be specific. We can list both, but I would also say that social workers are also trained in that area. I'm sitting next to one. Is that true?
Ignore them.
Depending on their license, yeah. Oh. Okay. I appreciate all the work from doing these in the past with different organizations. Appreciate the work you did in updating ours and including the special ed resolutions as well. I am wondering two things. I thought that the School Board Association did have a platform around just counselors, and so I want to go back and ask that question too, and maybe change it up. And then as we kind of move through this process and vote on the priorities, can we get talking points that are real specific to our district on each of them? I know that would be helpful before that meeting on the 16th, but then that we just have, kind of the impact of our local district might be helpful. And are you looking at us voting on this next week? Okay, so just for the timeline, because the legislative session starts February 4th, or I think 6th, 4th, early February. So if you want feedback on this, we need to get it to you by tomorrow.
It would be nice to have feedback as soon as possible, especially if it's an item that's not on here. I mean, language things are pretty easy to change, but if I need to research another topic, then I need to know that more quickly.
Okay, just wanted to confirm that.
And just echoing Rosie's point, obviously I haven't done any legislative priority work on the education side, but certainly on the healthcare side of things, making sure that we have very concrete points on telling our story, because the legislators want to be able to share that when they're on the floor. And then really honing and consolidating and making very specific asks. So even if there isn't a bill or a piece of proposed legislation that we can tack and ask onto, that we're really clear about what it is that we're asking, maybe not just convening a task force, but just really, really specific asks that are easy for folks to remember, because, we're one of how many constituency groups that they're going to be meeting with. So just being really thoughtful about what we're asking them for. And then, is there anything on here about equity? Because I think if that's, we know that Minnesota is one of the worst in the country, and we know that we're not, really stellar in that. So, okay. So we might want to tease it out even, especially following the conversations that we had today about wanting to be really thoughtful and deliberate about equity.
So how about full service community schools? Because isn't that something not funded or being changed funding-wise?
It was on the platform last year, but this not being a funding year, we tried. I tried to keep it more on language asks and changes in policy, but I could certainly include it. Kind of going back to the convening a task force point, that was one of the points that was on the resolution. That was the ask of the resolution.
Sure, and that was just kind of a for instance, but if there's a way that we can really hone the asks so that it's one sentence or whatever, and relatively specific, and even though it's not a funding year, it is an election year, and so so this isn't, I would imagine that the audience for this isn't just maybe we want to use it in St. Paul, but there's, I think, further implications for how we can use it too. Member Loeffler-Kemp?
Yeah, just, there's a balance of this really one-page platform being general to some extent, so it's could fit many bills that may come up, but then that talking points and kind of the user that we use as we're lobbying with our legislators, as well as the St. Louis County days, and that kind of having more specific ask. But so, wanting to keep it quick and easy bullets. So, yep.
Just a comment. I know I'm going to be out of town on the 16th, so I'll be thinking of you when I'm at a speech tournament, I think, in Harvard. So, and then is this what we go down for March 13th and 14th on Duluth days? I mean, where does this go? Is this for that?
We use it in a lot of different ways. That is one of the times that we use it heavily. But also when I'm talking to PTAs or the citywide PTA or other groups, other community groups, and asking them to help support us in these specific areas. I know that last year we had more asks on the back that were kind of, in my humble opinion, I think there were too many things on the platform last year to be able to focus on. And so I think if we can keep it to a one-page ask and have it more than a 5 font, that would be great. And I like having the information about the school district on the back for folks who maybe don't know as much about our schools right off the bat. But I know Katie will work some magic with this and make it look beautiful. So.
Well, I think that's our full agenda. So, dismissed.